The sun hung low and angry in the western sky, painting the barren land in the colors of rust and dying fire. The year was 1887, and the Wyoming Territory had become a cruel place to live. 3 years of drought had turned the grasslands into cracked plains of dust. The wind carried the taste of ash and loss, and the only things that still thrived were vultures and sorrow. Across that broken land, a lone figure moved, slowly, painfully, like a ghost that refused to rest. Margaret Sullivan, known once to her parents as Maggie, was just 19, though she looked older now. Hunger had carved hard lines into her soft face. Her calico dress, once a bright blue, was now dull and torn. The soles of her boots were worn through, and the dust had made her hair the same color as the ground. Her mother used to say the West tested a soul before it blessed it. But Maggie wasn't sure there were any blessings left to be found. She stopped at the top of a small rise and looked out across the wide emptiness. Sagebrush and sand stretched forever, broken only by distant mesas that shimmered in the heat. Behind her, the world she'd known was gone, her family's small homestead swallowed by debt, disease, and drought. Her father had died first, coughing up blood until there was nothing left in him to give. Her mother followed 2 days later, taken by the same cholera that had swept through their little settlement like a curse. Maggie had buried them both herself, using the last of her strength to mark the graves with wooden crosses. She'd left because there was nothing left to stay for. Now, 3 weeks later, the food she'd carried was gone. The water in her father's canteen was nearly dust. Each step felt heavier than the last. As the wind picked up, carrying the sting of alkali dust, she pulled her faded shawl tighter around her shoulders. She could feel her ribs pressing against the fabric. Her lips were cracked, her hands blistered from days of walking. Every mile she covered was an act of stubborn will, not strength. By late afternoon, she found shelter beside a large boulder. It was still warm from the day's sun, and she huddled against it, wrapping herself in her blanket. The wind moaned through the rocks like a lonely spirit. Maggie pressed her hand to the small leather pouch that hung around her neck. Inside was the last piece of her old life, a small daguerreotype of her parents, taken before everything went wrong. Her mother smiling gently, her father standing proud. "I'm trying, Ma," she whispered to the fading image. "I'm trying to be strong." But even strength couldn't fill an empty stomach. Her thoughts turned dark as night fell. The West was merciless to those who traveled alone, especially women. She'd heard stories whispered by others, women who traded their virtue for food, for protection, for a place to sleep. She'd always sworn she'd rather die than become one of them. But dying was no longer some faraway thought. It was close now, walking beside her with every step. When morning came, the air was cold enough to sting her cheeks. Frost sparkled faintly across the sand. She forced herself to stand, every joint aching from cold and exhaustion. As she adjusted her shawl, she heard it, faint but clear. The distant lowing of cattle carried on the wind. Her heart jumped. Where there were cattle, there were people. Where there were people, there was food. Maggie turned toward the sound and began walking. The land rolled gently downward, the wind pushing at her back as if urging her on. The smell of smoke and livestock grew stronger with every step, and then, through a gap in the hills, she saw it, a ranch. It wasn't large, but to her eyes, it looked like heaven. A weathered barn, a corral, a few horses grazing near a shallow creek that still shimmered with water. Smoke rose from the chimney of a small house. She stopped on the ridge and tried to make herself look presentable, brushing dust from her dress, fixing her tangled hair. But there was no hiding what she was. A starving girl with nothing to her name. The thought of knocking on that door terrified her. She could imagine the look she might receive, a mixture of pity and suspicion. A lone woman wandering in from the plains? People always assumed the worst. She swallowed hard. There was one thing she could offer, one thing men valued. The thought made her stomach twist. But what other choice did she have? She'd rather shame herself than die in the dust. "Forgive me, Ma," she whispered, pulling the blue ribbon from her pocket, the one her mother had worn at her wedding. She pressed it to her lips before tucking it away again. "I just want to live." She started down the hillside, stumbling more than walking. By the time she reached the bottom, the sun was blazing overhead, turning the air thick and shimmering. Her throat burned with every breath. But she kept moving, each step driven by the faint hope that someone inside that house might show mercy. Then the wind changed. A strange rumble rolled across the land. Maggie turned toward the horizon and froze. A wall of dust, high as a mountain, was bearing down on her. Her breath caught. A storm. One of the great dust devils that could strip a person to the bone. She ran. The ranch was still a mile away, the dust rolling faster than any horse could gallop. The air grew heavy. The sky darkened to a sickly yellow-brown. She stumbled, tripped, scraped her hands raw on the hard ground, but forced herself up again. Her lungs screamed. The storm howled closer. The first gust hit her like a hammer. Sand stung her face, tearing at her clothes. The world became a blur of dust and wind and noise. She could barely see the ground beneath her. Then, her hand struck something solid. A fence post. Clutching it, she pulled herself forward, following the line by touch. The wind roared like a freight train. Her shawl whipped away into the storm. Her body felt like it was being peeled apart. Just when she thought she'd collapse for good, hands grabbed her shoulders. Strong hands. She tried to scream, but the dust filled her mouth. The hands pulled her forward, through a door, into silence. The sound of the storm muffled to a dull roar behind thick wooden walls. Maggie collapsed onto the floor, coughing and gasping for air. Her whole body shook. Voices surrounded her, rough, male voices. "Lord Almighty, where'd she come from?" "Outta the storm like a ghost." "Half dead she is." Maggie blinked through tears and grit. A bearded man knelt beside her, holding a tin cup. "Easy, girl," he said. "Drink." She took a sip of water so cold it burned her throat. "Where's your people?" someone asked. She tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Gone, all gone." The men exchanged glances. She could see the thoughts behind their eyes. What kind of woman wandered alone into a storm like this? One of them stepped closer, his grin unpleasant. "Well now," he drawled. "Reckon she's got something she can trade for a warm meal." Maggie's heart pounded. Before anyone could speak again, another voice cut through the room, steady, deep, and commanding. "That's enough." The men turned. A tall figure stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light. Dust clung to his coat, and his hat shadowed his eyes, but his presence filled the room like thunder before a storm. "She's a guest," he said evenly. "Not a prize." Quote. The ranch hand stepped back, chastened. Maggie looked up at him, and for the first time in months, felt something she hadn't known she still could. Hope. The tall man stepped forward, dust swirling around his boots as he shut the door behind him. His voice, calm but firm, carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Jake," he said to the bearded hand, "get her some water and food. The rest of you, back to work. The storm's not letting up anytime soon, and I don't pay men to stand around gawking." The room fell quiet, except for the muffled howl of wind outside. The men hesitated, then shuffled toward the door, muttering under their breath. Only the bearded man, Jake, lingered long enough to hand Maggie a tin cup and a small plate of bread and beans before following the others out. The stranger knelt beside her, his gray eyes studying her face. He looked to be in his 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair black as night and a trace of silver at his temples. His face was lean, weathered by sun and wind. When he spoke again, his voice softened. "Can you stand?" Quote. Maggie tried, but her legs gave way beneath her. "Easy," he said, catching her elbow. "No one's gonna hurt you here." Her throat worked as she forced out her name. "Maggie Sullivan." "Miss Sullivan," he said, as if testing the sound of it. "You're lucky to be alive. That dust storm would have buried you if you'd been caught in the open another minute." She nodded weakly. "I was trying to reach the ranch. I thought maybe I could find work, or—" Her voice broke. She couldn't say the words. that she'd been ready to offer herself for a meal. He studied her in silence for a long moment. "You're at the Triple H Ranch," he said at last. "I'm James Henderson." The name hit her with quiet recognition. She'd heard it once before, back when her father still had neighbors to talk to. Henderson's ranch was one of the largest left standing after the drought. A man known for fairness, but also for being hard as iron when it came to running his land. He guided her to a bench near the stove, then poured water into a tin cup from a jug. "Drink slow," he said. "You'll make yourself sick if you rush." She obeyed, sipping carefully while he watched. The water was the sweetest thing she'd tasted in weeks. When she finished, she dared to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't cold, but there was something guarded there, like a man who'd seen too much loss and didn't trust what the world offered anymore. "Where are your people?" he asked quietly. "Gone, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The cholera took my mother and father. The bank took our land. I've been walking ever since." He frowned slightly but didn't press her. Instead, he turned to the stove, where Jake had left a pot of beans simmering. He ladled some into a bowl and placed it in front of her. "Eat." Maggie hesitated, hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. The first bite nearly made her weep. She ate slowly, aware of him watching, but too hungry to care. When she was done, she set the spoon down with a shaking sigh. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'll repay you somehow." He gave a short, tired smile. "Repay me by not dying on my floor." Quote. She blinked, unsure if it was a joke, but there was a hint of warmth in his tone that made her lips twitch in return. After a pause, he said, "There's a spare room off the kitchen in the main house. You can stay there until the storm passes. We'll talk about work after that." She stood, wobbling slightly. "I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," he said simply. Then, turning toward the door, he called for one of the hands to bring her belongings, though all she carried was a small, tattered pack. He led her through the whipping dust toward the house, shielding her from the wind with his body. The main house wasn't fancy, but solid. Timber walls and stone foundation, built by someone who understood both pride and practicality. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the faint scent of wood smoke and coffee. "This way," he said, lighting a lantern and guiding her through the kitchen. "That door there, storage room off the pantry. It's not much, but you'll be out of the wind." Maggie stepped inside. It was small, but there was a cot with a thin blanket and a small window that rattled in the storm. After weeks of sleeping in the open, it felt like a palace. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, setting the lantern on a shelf. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." When he turned to leave, she found herself saying softly, "Mr. Henderson?" He paused. "I can cook, clean, so if you need mending done, I'll earn my keep." He regarded her for a moment, then said, "We'll see." And with that, he left, closing the door behind him. For a long time, Maggie sat on the cot, staring at the flame of the lantern. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking like 1,000 lost souls. She wrapped herself in the blanket and lay down, exhaustion pulling her into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she awoke, the storm had passed. Pale morning light filtered through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Weak, yes, but safe. She washed her face in the basin outside the kitchen, then began searching through the shelves for something useful. The place was tidy but tired, its surfaces dulled by neglect. She found coffee beans, flour, and a slab of salt pork in the pantry. If she was going to prove her worth, she would start here. By the time Henderson entered the kitchen, drawn by the smell of brewing coffee, she already had a pan of biscuits rising in the oven and bacon sizzling in the skillet. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the stove, "but it needed doing." He studied her for a moment, then took a seat at the table. "You cook like someone who's done it all her life." "My mother taught me. Said good food keeps a house together." "That it does." He poured himself coffee and gestured to the other chair. "Sit, Miss Sullivan." She hesitated but obeyed. The biscuits came out golden and steaming. She served him first, then took one for herself. They ate in silence until he set his cup down. "I'm not one for charity," he said, "but I'm not cruel either. If you mean to work, we'll try it for a week. You'll earn your keep, meals, a place to sleep, and $1 a day if it works out." Her eyes widened. $1 a day was more than fair. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "It's James," he corrected gently. "You'll answer to, Miss Sullivan, but no need to call me sir every other word." "Yes, James," she said, testing the name. He smiled faintly. "We'll see how you manage. The men eat early and hard. They'll test you with their appetites before their manners." She nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in months. When he rose to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing," he said. "Some of those men have been without company for a long time. You stay near the main house after dark, and if anyone gives you trouble, you come to me. Understood?" "Yes," she said softly. After he left, she stood in the quiet kitchen, her hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from relief. For the first time since her parents died, she wasn't running. She had shelter, food, and a chance to begin again. And though she didn't yet understand why, the way James Henderson had looked at her, steady, protective, and kind, stirred something deep inside her chest. It wasn't desire. Not yet, but it was the first flicker of hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Maggie hadn't known she missed, the rhythm of purpose. She rose before dawn, lit the stove, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and baked biscuits while the sky was still painted in shades of gray. When the ranch hands came in from morning chores, they found hot food waiting, and their surprise slowly turned to gratitude. Even James Henderson, who had first kept a cautious distance, began to linger longer in the kitchen each morning. At first, they spoke little, just practical things about chores, weather, and supplies, but soon their conversation stretched longer. Maggie discovered he had a dry humor that crept into his voice when he was comfortable, and he discovered that she was more than a frightened girl. She was sharp, resourceful, and full of quiet strength. The men's behavior improved too. Billy, the youngest of the ranch hands, had made a few crude comments at first, but one stern look from Henderson had ended that. He made sure every man on the Triple H knew that Maggie Sullivan was under his protection. Still, the West was not a place for complacency. Danger rode hidden in every shadow, and hardship had a way of testing those who thought themselves safe. 2 weeks after she'd arrived, the heat came back stronger than before. The creek that fed the ranch began to shrink, the once cool water now a sluggish trickle through cracked earth. The cattle bawled in thirst, the men grew restless. Henderson spent long hours on horseback, searching for new water sources. When he returned late one evening, dust clinging to his clothes and worry etched deep in his face, Maggie was waiting with supper on the table. "No luck?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Every stream's dry, the well's dropping fast. If we don't find water soon, we'll lose half the herd." Quote. Maggie thought for a long moment, then pointed to a spot on the map he'd spread across the table. "My father used to say cottonwoods grow where water hides beneath the ground. There's a stand of them here, see, near that rocky ridge?" Henderson studied the map, then her face. "You're certain?" "No, sir," she said, "but it might be worth a try." He nodded slowly. "At first light, we'll go." The next morning they rode out together under a sky pale with heat. Maggie rode Martha's old mare, a gentle chestnut that moved steady beneath her. They reached the grove of cottonwoods by noon. The ground was baked hard, but the leaves were greener than any she'd seen in weeks. "Here," Maggie said, kneeling in the dust. She dug with her hands, the dirt cool just a few inches down. "Feel that?" Henderson crouched beside her, pressing his palm into the soil. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's damp." By sundown, the men had gathered with shovels and picks. They dug through the night, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. And just as dawn broke, water gushed up from the hole, clear and cold. A shout went up across the camp, rough voices full of joy. Maggie sat back, laughing and crying all at once as the men splashed their faces. Henderson turned to her, eyes bright. "You found it," he said, wonder softening his voice. "You saved this place." "It was luck," she said, smiling through tears. "It was you," he said firmly. "And I don't believe in luck." That night the ranch came alive again. The men built a fire, passing around coffee and songs. Maggie watched them from the porch, her heart swelling at the sight of their laughter. Henderson joined her, leaning against the railing. "You brought life back to this ranch," he said quietly. "I just did what needed doing." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the truth in his eyes, something deeper than gratitude. Something that frightened and warmed her all at once. "Maggie," he began, his voice lower now, "I've been alone a long time. Since Martha passed, I stopped believing there could be anything more than work and survival. Then you came out of that storm half dead and turned this place into a home again." She froze, her heart pounding. "I know what people would say," he went on. "You're young, and I'm not. You work for me, and that's reason enough for tongues to wag. But I can't pretend I don't feel it. I care for you, Maggie. More than I should." She looked down at her hands, rough and red from work. "I'm not the kind of woman men fall for, Mr. Henderson. I came here with nothing. I would have traded myself for food if you hadn't stopped me." He stepped closer, his voice firm. "And that's what you don't understand. Gold isn't what we need out here. It's people, it's courage, it's someone who refuses to give up when everything around her does. That's worth more than anything." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't mean that." He reached out, his calloused hand brushing her cheek with surprising gentleness. "I've never meant anything more." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of crickets filled the air, the stars burning bright above the wide, dark prairie. Then she whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready to love again, James. Not yet." He nodded slowly. "Then don't. Let's start with trust, with building something together. The rest will come in its own time." She smiled faintly. "You're a stubborn man. Out here, that's the only kind that survives." Weeks passed, and the drought finally broke. Heavy rains swept across the plains, filling the creek and soaking the thirsty ground. The ranch flourished again. Grass grew green, the cattle fattened, and laughter returned to the bunkhouse. And one evening, as thunder rolled softly in the distance, James found Maggie in the garden she'd revived. The setting sun turned her hair to fire, her hands still dirty from planting new seeds. He stepped behind her and said, "Maggie!" She turned, smiling at the sound of his voice. "I've waited long enough," he said, his voice steady but thick with feeling. "I want you as my wife, not because I pity you, but because I've never met a woman I respect more." Her throat tightened, tears spilling over before she could stop them. "I'd have nothing if not for you," she whispered. "You're wrong," he said, taking her hands in his. "I'd have nothing if not for you." And there, in the fading light, Margaret Sullivan, once a starving orphan on the edge of death, became Margaret Henderson, wife to the man who saw her worth when she could not. The West had tested her, nearly broken her, and then given her something she'd stopped believing in. Love, born not from need, but from mutual strength. The rains kept falling that night, soft and endless. And inside the old ranch house, with a fire burning low and steady, two souls who'd survived the storm finally found their peace.